Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I'm your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth, well, that's another story. Now imagine this. You're in a quiet neighborhood and you're walking home with a bag of snacks. It's late, rain has just begun to fall, and suddenly you notice someone is following you. They're watching your every move. Do you keep walking? Do you confront them? What happens next? That is the question at the heart of today's case, one of the most polarizing in recent history. The 2012 encounter between 17-year-old Trayvon Martin and neighborhood watch volunteer George Zimmerman sparked a national debate about race, self-defense, and justice in America. Zimmerman claimed he acted in self-defense after being attacked, but others saw this as an unjustified killing of an unarmed black teenager. What began as a local incident quickly gained national attention, with passionate voices on both sides of this debate. The question remains, was it self-defense? Or did George Zimmerman go too far? This case challenges us to examine not just the legal definitions of self-defense, but the social implications of the verdict. In this episode, we will dive into the events of that fateful night, the arguments presented by both the prosecution and defense, and why this case continues to evoke strong reactions, even years later. By the end, you are going to have the chance to decide for yourself, was justice truly served, or is there more to the story? Stick with me here as we uncover the details of this complex and deeply divisive case. Okay, now that we've set the stage, let's walk through what actually happened in this case, fact by fact, as documented in court and public records. Okay, so on the night of February 26th, back in 2012, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was walking through a gated community in Sanford, Florida, after purchasing snacks at a nearby convenience store. He was unarmed. He was wearing a hoodie. He was talking to a friend on the phone. George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old neighborhood watch volunteer, spotted Martin and reported what he described as a suspicious person to the police. Now, despite being told by the dispatcher not to follow Martin, Zimmerman exited his vehicle and began pursuing him on foot. Accounts diverge at this point, but it's undisputed that an altercation occurred between the two. Zimmerman claimed Martin attacked him, punching him in the nose and pinning him to the ground. He further stated that Martin reached for Zimmerman's firearm, prompting Zimmerman to shoot him in self-defense. The single gunshot killed Martin at the scene. When police arrived, Zimmerman was taken into custody but released shortly after, with law enforcement citing a lack of evidence to dispute his self-defense claim under Florida's controversial Stand Your Ground law. The case didn't gain widespread attention until Martin's family and activists pushed for Zimmerman's arrest, which finally happened 6 weeks later. The trial itself was highly publicized, with the prosecution arguing that Zimmerman had racially profiled Martin and acted recklessly in pursuing him. The defense maintained that Zimmerman had no choice but to act in self-defense after being attacked. In July of 2013, a jury found Zimmerman not guilty of second-degree murder and manslaughter. But the verdict did not end the story. Of course it didn't. Instead, it ignited a nationwide conversation about what was all involved here: race, gun laws, and the limits of self-defense, with opinions sharply divided along cultural and political lines. As we continue here, we're going to examine the arguments presented during the trial and explore the broader implications of this case. So stick with me, there is a lot to unpack. Let's start with the retreat at Twin Lakes. This is the gated community where this incident occurred. They had experienced a rise in burglaries at that time and petty crimes, in the months leading up to this shooting. Residents were on edge because of this, and George Zimmerman, who served as the neighborhood watch coordinator, took his role seriously. He often made calls to the police about perceived threats in the community. And before we judge Zimmerman here, isn't that what we want our neighborhood watch person to do? Or what else are they doing out there? Now, Trayvon Martin, on the other hand, he was visiting the area with his father, who was staying with his fiancée, so they're having a nice time. And that evening, Trayvon walked to a nearby 7-Eleven. That's it. Bought a bag of Skittles and an iced tea. It was a rainy night. Trayvon was wearing a hoodie, which would later become a symbol of the case. Zimmerman's call to 911 detailed his observations of Trayvon as walking slowly and looking around, behaving in a way Zimmerman considered suspicious. He described Trayvon as up to no good and continued to follow him, despite the dispatcher advising, "We do not need you to do that." At some point, Zimmerman exited his vehicle and began pursuing Trayvon on foot. This decision would later be scrutinized heavily in court and by the public. Trayvon, meanwhile, was on the phone with a friend, Rachel, telling her that he was being followed. She reportedly told him to run, but Trayvon expressed confusion and concern over why he was being pursued. The timeline becomes unclear from this point, because there are no eyewitnesses who saw the full encounter. What is known is that a physical altercation did ensue, during which Zimmerman sustained injuries, including a bloody nose and lacerations to the back of his head. Now, Trayvon Martin was shot once in the chest, and Zimmerman claimed self-defense, stating he feared for his life. When police arrived, Zimmerman was cooperative and admitted to shooting Trayvon. Officers initially treated the incident as a case of self-defense under Florida's Stand Your Ground law. Zimmerman was not charged that night, and Trayvon's body was identified the following day using a photo provided by his family. This timeline is pivotal to understanding this case. Each moment has been dissected and debated, with both sides presenting vastly different interpretations of what really happened. So as we move forward, we're going to explore the courtroom battle that unfolded and the arguments that each side brought to light. Following the initial investigation, public outrage began to grow over the lack of charges against George Zimmerman. Trayvon Martin's parents, Tracy Martin and Sabrina Fulton, became vocal advocates for justice, calling for an arrest and a full investigation. Their efforts sparked national protests with slogans like "Justice for Trayvon" and demonstrations where participants donned hoodies in solidarity. Media coverage of the case brought it into the national spotlight, with opinions sharply divided. On one side, many viewed Trayvon as a victim of racial profiling and an unjust system that failed to protect Black lives. On the other hand, Zimmerman's supporters argued that he acted within his legal rights to defend himself against an imminent threat. Now, in April 2012, 6 weeks after the shooting, Zimmerman gets charged with second-degree murder and manslaughter, following a thorough investigation led by a special prosecutor. He turned himself in. He was released on bond shortly thereafter, and this marked the beginning of a highly publicized trial that would captivate the nation. The prosecution sought to portray Zimmerman as a vigilante who profiled Trayvon based on his race and escalated the situation unnecessarily by pursuing him. They presented evidence, including the 911 call, in which Zimmerman described Trayvon as a real suspicious guy. They argued that Zimmerman ignored police instructions not to follow Trayvon, leading to the tragic confrontation. The defense countered this with a narrative emphasizing Zimmerman's injuries and his claim that Trayvon attacked him first. Witness testimony and forensic evidence were presented to support Zimmerman's claim of self-defense. Key to their argument was the assertion that Zimmerman feared for his life when he discharged his weapon. A major point of contention during the trial was Florida's stand your ground law. While Zimmerman's defense did not officially invoke the law, it was central to the case because it shaped the initial police response and the legal framework surrounding self-defense claims. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with both sides delivering emotional closing arguments. The jury, 6 women, 5 of whom were white, deliberated over 16 hours before delivering their verdict of not guilty. Zimmerman walked free, but the case was far from over in the court of public opinion. In fact, the verdict only deepened the divide, with widespread protests and debates about race, gun rights, and justice continuing long after the trial concluded. But as the trial did unfold, both sides presented powerful arguments, each shaping a distinct narrative about what happened that rainy night in Sanford, Florida. The prosecution painted George Zimmerman as a vigilante. And if we haven't noticed, people that have tried to use the self-defense laws that are there to protect someone who is trying to invoke self-defense, oftentimes it's the vigilante argument. And that's again what's happening here. I'm just pointing it out. It happens often. But in this case, they emphasize that Zimmerman flat out ignored police instructions to stop following Trayvon. This piece of information is crucial. This ultimately created a situation that escalated into violence, and this was part of the prosecution's argument. And it hinged on the idea that Trayvon had every right to be in the neighborhood, and that Zimmerman's actions were not those of a responsible neighborhood watch volunteer, but of someone looking for trouble. Now, central to their case was the 911 call Zimmerman made before this encounter even happened. The prosecution pointed out phrases like, "They always get away," as evidence that Zimmerman had a mindset suggesting he'd already judged Trayvon as a criminal before anything had even happened. And they argued that this was bias and it set the stage for the fatal confrontation. Rachel, who was the friend of Trayvon who was speaking to him on the phone shortly before anything happened, testified for the prosecution, and she recounted Trayvon's fear of being followed and his belief that Zimmerman was a creepy-ass cracker. Her testimony added emotional weight, but was criticized for inconsistencies on how she handled the cross-examination. But here we have both people judging. You have Zimmerman judging that this must already be a criminal, whoever's out in the dark. And because Trayvon can see it's a white man out, he's calling him a creepy-ass cracker. So which side is better at this moment? Not sure. But now we have the defense's side and what they had to say, and they leaned heavily on Zimmerman's account of self-defense, arguing that Trayvon initiated the physical confrontation because he struck Zimmerman, broke his nose, and then slammed his head into the concrete. Photos of Zimmerman's injuries were presented as evidence of the struggle. The defense team also used forensic evidence to bolster their argument. Gunshot residue tests showed that the firearm was discharged at close range, consistent with Zimmerman's claim that Trayvon was on top of him during the shooting. They also pointed out that Trayvon's knuckles showed signs of injury, supporting Zimmerman's story that Trayvon struck him first. But you're Trayvon Martin, you're a 16-year-old getting a snack, and you see someone who's following you, someone not of your race, someone that maybe you feel is intimidating or is causing you fear. Are you going to react and defend yourself? Because that's what sounds like Trayvon was trying to do. More misunderstanding. But a key strategy for the defense was humanizing Zimmerman, portraying him as a community-minded individual who had simply found himself in a life-threatening situation. And they argued that the decision to shoot was not driven by malice, but by survival and instinct. Well, this clash of perspectives left the jury with much to consider, as each side sought to frame the events in starkly different ways. We're going to explore more of the arguments, the complexity of this case, and all the details just become more evident as to how difficult it is to try to analyze cases like this. The defense also focused on Trayvon Martin's actions leading up to the confrontation, suggesting that Trayvon's behavior could have been interpreted as threatening. They argued that Zimmerman was justified in his suspicion because of prior burglaries in the neighborhood and Trayvon's unfamiliar presence there. A pivotal moment in the trial came when the defense brought in forensic experts to analyze the trajectory of the gunshot, the positions of Zimmerman and Trayvon during the altercation. And their testimony supported Zimmerman's claim that Trayvon was on top of him, pinning him to the ground when the fatal shot was fired. This physical evidence bolstered the defense's narrative of self-defense. Another significant point of contention was the interpretation of Trayvon's character. The defense brought up details about Trayvon's past, including school suspensions, text messages referencing fights, to suggest a pattern of aggression. And this move was highly controversial, as the prosecution argued that was irrelevant and only designed to unfairly sway the jury. How his past is, what he's done at school, and other things could never have come into play during their encounter. Was Zimmerman going to ask him those questions about his past and learn about Trayvon? No, he would not have had time. Critics of this approach saw it as a way to paint Trayvon as a stereotypical troubled teen, further fueling racial undertones in the case. Meanwhile, the prosecution, they sought to dismantle Zimmerman's credibility, and they argued that Zimmerman's injuries were not severe enough to justify lethal force, pointing out inconsistencies in his account of the events. For instance, Zimmerman claimed he had been pinned and unable to move, but the prosecution questioned why his firearm was still accessible then. Why was he able to retrieve it and fire it and get all of that done if he was pinned? The prosecution also emphasized the broader implications of Zimmerman's actions, arguing his decision to follow Trayvon despite police advice not to. It set a dangerous precedent. They contended that Zimmerman's choices escalated a situation that could have been avoided entirely. Both sides also sparred over the role of race in the case. The prosecution suggested that Zimmerman's assumptions about Trayvon were influenced by racial profiling, a claim Zimmerman and his defense vehemently denied. The defense countered that Zimmerman's concerns were based solely on Trayvon's behavior, not his race. And this back and forth highlighted the deep divisions in public opinion, as the case became a flashpoint for broader conversations about all of this, race and justice and legal limits that happen when dealing with self-defense claims. This trial may have ended with George Zimmerman's acquittal, but the case's impact extended far beyond the courtroom. It was a nationwide debate, and it's still relevant today. At its core, the controversy revolved around three critical issues: race, gun laws, and the boundaries of self-defense. First and foremost, the racial dynamics of the case ignited fierce debates. Trayvon Martin, a young black teenager, became a symbol of racial injustice in America. Many argued Zimmerman's initial suspicion of Trayvon was rooted in racial profiling, a claim Zimmerman denied. Critics pointed out that Zimmerman's description of Trayvon to the dispatcher, focused on his clothing and behavior, reflected broader societal biases that unfairly criminalize young black men. The defense and Zimmerman's supporters pushed back, arguing that race played no role in Zimmerman's actions or the subsequent trial. However, the broader conversation about racial profiling and systemic inequality could not be ignored. Protests and rallies across the nation called attention to what many saw as a failure of the justice system to value black lives equally. Another major point of contention was Florida's stand your ground law. While Zimmerman's defense did not explicitly rely on this law, it influenced the initial decision not to arrest him. The law's provision that individuals have no duty to retreat when facing a perceived threat raises questions about how such statutes are applied and whether they disproportionately protect those who escalate confrontations. Perceived threat. It's always a question. Critics argue that stand your ground laws create a dangerous precedent, allowing individuals to use deadly force in situations that might otherwise be de-escalated. The public also debated the media's role in shaping perceptions of the case. Early reports often included conflicting information, such as outdated photos of Trayvon as a young boy and varying descriptions of Zimmerman's injuries. These discrepancies fueled public distrust and deepened divisions. While some saw Trayvon as an innocent victim of racial bias, others viewed Zimmerman as a law-abiding citizen defending himself. This polarizing wasn't limited to public opinion. Politicians, activists, celebrities, everybody weighed in, further amplifying the case's visibility and emotional charge. The controversy surrounding the Trayvon Martin case wasn't just about the trial. It became a turning point for broader cultural and political movements in the United States. In the wake of Zimmerman's acquittal, the phrase "Black Lives Matter" emerged as a rallying cry, giving birth to a movement that would redefine conversations about race and justice. Trayvon's name became synonymous with the fight against systemic racism, as activists argued that his death symbolized a pattern of devaluing Black lives within the justice system. Critics of the movement questioned its focus on Zimmerman's case, arguing that the legal outcome was consistent with Florida's self-defense laws. Supporters countered that the issue was much bigger than this one verdict. It was about challenging a system that allowed a young Black teenager to be killed under questionable circumstances without immediate accountability. This also raised confusing questions. What if this were a young white boy that no one could see in the dark? Could Zimmerman in the moment know for sure if this was a young Black man? Was this a target of a young Black teenager? Are there two things happening here, two questions being raised? We have a man who claims self-defense, who is now on trial for killing a young Black man. These lines get blurred. This is why these cases are so difficult. And then, of course, you have the gun laws. These came under intense scrutiny as well. Florida's Stand Your Ground law faced criticism from those who argued it emboldened individuals to escalate conflicts. I get to do this because the law says I can. Opponents called for reforms to prevent similar incidents, while defenders of the law maintained that it protected the right to self-defense. This debate echoed beyond Florida, sparking legislative discussions in other states about the balance between personal safety and public accountability. Again, back to perceived threat. If someone perceives their life is in danger, are we not allowed to defend ourselves? Well, the answer is yes, most of the time. But the question becomes in what you perceived as a threat, was it even really a threat? So it comes down to, was your judgment correct in that moment? That is what you're on trial for a lot of the time in self-defense cases. Gun laws cannot help how someone perceives a threat. Only a human can do that. Now, we also have the media, who played a complex role in amplifying the controversy. Of course, both Trayvon and George were subject to intense scrutiny during all of this, with their personal lives and histories dissected in ways that shaped public opinion. Trayvon's school suspensions and social media posts were used to portray him negatively by some. What does that have to do with him going to 7-Eleven and getting shot? Then you have others who criticized Zimmerman's history of 911 calls and his self-appointed role in the Neighborhood Watch program. But we do have Neighborhood Watch programs, and isn't that what they're supposed to do? Gets confusing. Then you have social media, which added another layer. All of this happens in all of the cases these days, guys. Social media transformed the case into a global conversation. There were hashtags, viral posts, online campaigns, all of it allowing people from all walks of life to weigh in. But this also fueled major misinformation and polarized narratives because we lose facts, starting with the media. And then it just goes from there. The digital discourse often reduced the case to sound bites and memes, which we're used to seeing, but it devalues the facts. It loses the nuance of the actual legal arguments and the actual evidence that is being presented or is going to be presented or was presented at a trial. But the public doesn't get to know that when they're hearing those sound bites and seeing those memes. Ultimately, the Trayvon Martin case became a prism through which Americans viewed deeply rooted issues: race relations, gun rights, the justice system itself, all because a man saw someone in the dark in Florida that night. Blew up and raised all kinds of questions, arguments, and discussions. And these discussions did not end with the verdict. It did not shut anything down. And they still continue to influence cultural and legal landscapes to this day. And as we come to the end of this case here in this episode, the facts, the arguments, the controversies, it all leaves us with more questions than answers. Was George Zimmerman genuinely acting in self-defense? Or did his actions that night escalate a situation that could have been avoided? Was Trayvon Martin unfairly profiled, a victim not just of that night, but of broader societal biases? For many, this case is not just about specific events in Sanford, Florida. It's about how we define justice. The court's ruling was clear. Zimmerman was found not guilty. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict remains deeply divided for many reasons. Some say Zimmerman's actions were within the bounds of these self-defense laws. Others feel Trayvon was targeted, disregarded as a young black teenager. So where do you stand? What do you think happened that night? What if you had been there as either person? Do you believe the jury got it right? Do you think this was an easy choice? Maybe you see this as a miscarriage of justice. This case invites us all to grapple with the complex intersection of law, morality, and societal values. The Trayvon Martin case is not just a story about these two individuals, the vision of the broader struggles that divide all of us. It raises pressing questions about how we perceive one another, how we apply the law, and what justice truly means in a country grappling with its history of inequality. For some, the legal system worked as it was intended. Zimmerman followed the procedures of a lawful defense, and the jury made their decision based on the evidence presented. But for others, the case exposed cracks in that system, a system they feel is too often weighted against people like Trayvon Martin. The emotions surrounding this case are not just about the facts. They're tied to experiences and identities and beliefs that shape how we interpret those facts. Maybe that's why years later this case still sparks heated debates and inspires movements for change, and why we continue to question the laws that we live by that cannot bend as each experience unfolds. As you reflect on what you have heard today, ask yourself, how would you have reacted in Zimmerman's position? What about Trayvon's? What does justice look like in this case? not just legally, but ethically and morally. The court has rendered its verdict, but in the court of public opinion, the discussion is far from over. Where do you stand? Thank you for joining me in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, stay curious, and ask the difficult questions. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.